Hey guys, welcome to the first Fish event of the series we got going on here. This is Jake and Jon in the fish tank. I'm Jon, and big news coming to you. You guys are hearing it first. Officially a pro staffer for FishUSA, so look out for me on social media.
On this episode, we're going to go over pan fishing and trout fishing.
But before we break down today's segment, we're going to introduce to you some new products exclusive to FishUSA. So what I have here is some new Pheasant tail and Beadtail nymphs that we're going to be offering exclusively to you guys. And then Jake's going to show you what else we got.
Yeah, and to go along with those flies too, I think we have 100 different SKUs to go along with all those flies. Anything from your small nymphs all the way up to your big streamers and egg patterns. What I got here is what I thought was pretty cool. They're a new Kalen's product. It's a little swim bait. I mean, it would be killer for fishing for crappies and even a small little trout swim bait too.
Pretty sweet. What are they called?
They're the Kalen's Tickle Tail. I mean, not a lot of people think about throwing soft swim baits for trout and steelhead and stuff, but that can be a killer, especially in clear water.
Sounds like some new products.
For sure. So I'm just going to start with talking about crappie fishing, perch, bluegill also. Early season, the number one thing you have to look for is warm water. Obviously, the warmer water is going to be up shallow. So as soon as that sun starts peeking out, I mean, you don't even have to wake up first thing in the early morning because you got to wait for that sun to come out and warm that water up. If there's any structure in the water, like wood, lily pads, any aquatic grass, a hard bottom too, that's going to be the first that warms up. And that's what those fish are going to be relating to.
I think that's a good tip that not a lot of people think about is when that sun first comes out in the morning, like it's cold in the morning, so you don't have to get up first thing, and that sun is going to warm up hard objects first in that shallow water, so those fish will really gravitate to those hard objects like what you said, lily pad, hard cover like wood, any kind of concrete structures. So those fish gravitate to that just for a couple degree warmth.
And before they move up and they hit that hard structure, they're going to be kind of sitting out a little bit deeper. So if you can only fish right in the morning for some reason, right at sunlight, fish a little bit deeper. They might always be holding against that hard structure, but early in the morning they might be sitting out a little bit further, and then as the sun comes up, starts warming up the water, they're going to slide in closer. And that's where you can really start targeting them easier, especially if you're a shore angler.
Okay, well that's a pretty good where we're going to catch them. Let's talk about some of the gear we're going to be throwing to get these fish.
So everybody knows if you crappie fish, you know what this little guy is. That's a Bobby Garland baby shad. That's probably your number one bait for early season pan fishing. I mean, giant bluegills, perch, especially big crappies like this kind of stuff. I always tell people, especially in the pro shop, when they come in, they're like, Jake, what do I throw for crappies? I've never really done it before. My number one tip is use a bait that moves when you're not moving it. So, check this out. I don't know if you'll be able to pick that up on the camera.
That little tail's just wiggling even when you're not doing anything.
Yep, I'm not even holding that. I'm not shaking that bait at all, but that tail is moving. So when it's sitting there and it's just barely twitching like that, that's what drives those fish up the wall. I mean, they're still in cold water. They're still sluggish. They don't want to come out and absolutely smoke a fast-moving bait. So something like that, I mean, it's chartreuse. It's not very lifelike, but that tail right there, that just makes them go crazy.
I think they call that secondary action, whether it be like a marabou jig or anything with little appendages like that are going to move when that water's flowing, not so that you don't have to sit there and impart the action to the bait.
For sure. And then once you do a little bit later in the day, when the water starts warming up, my go-to is a Mr. Twister. This is a Southern Pro. It's a hot grub. Obviously, Mr. Twister makes their plastic also. But the Southern Pro, I like those a lot. They have a great selection of colors. And what I like about them is that it doesn't take a whole lot to get that tail, that curly tail, moving. So
I think it's a bait that people forget about a lot. Like everybody that fishes has heard about it. It's kind of what everybody's first introduced to, but as you get into it, you kind of forget about that and you think, oh, there's bigger and better things. But sometimes it's just nice to go back to the simple things.
For sure. And also, a lot of people think that you have to crappie fish, panfish with the float. I mean, this past weekend, we were fishing in really, really skinny water. I mean, we were fishing in a foot deep. And the bottom was real mucky and slimy, so you had to keep that bait real high up off the bottom. So we didn't use a float. We would just rig it up with just like a jig head like I have in this Bobby Garland. That's actually a Strike King slasher jig head. I really like those.
Wicked looking jig head.
Yeah, I mean, they have a gaff hook on them, and that angle on that hook gets those light mouthed crappie. I don't know if
paper lips.
Paper lip. Once they come up and they grab it, instead of hooking them right in that paper lip, it gets them right in the roof of the mouth, right in that hard stuff, so they can't really shake it loose. But I just put one of those hot grubs right on one of those jig heads, and just cast it out there, keep my rod tip real high, and just really, real slow. Just enough for that curly tail to start moving.
I think that's one thing that people also don't think a lot about is the floats. Like when you cast it out, if that water's pretty slick, like if there's no wind, those fish can sense what's going on around them. So if a big float hits the water, like those rocket bobbers or any of those big slip floats, they're gonna know it. And if you're fishing in 3 foot or less, as soon as that lands anywhere near them, they're gonna take off. Because I don't know if you've seen it, but when I pond fish, when that water's real cold, where you're allowed to see those fish really easily, anytime something lands near them, you watch them just scatter away from you. So I think a float is a really good option when you're fishing deeper. But if you're fishing really shallow and it's really calm, I would go to a lighter jig head, maybe like a 32nd ounce, even a 64th, and that's when I would put that curly tail or something like that on because it has that slower fall. That's a good tip.
For sure. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about tubes. I mean,
I think everybody knows what a tube is for fishes for bluegills and crappies.
Yeah, I mean, tubes have been around for forever, since the dawn of crappie fishing, I swear.
Yeah.
But this is the Southern Pro Hustler. This is my favorite color, black and chartreuse.
Mine too.
Yeah, they call this color money. It's money, man.
Can't beat it.
It's just black and chartreuse, and it has a little bit of red flake in it. But you just take one of these jig heads. It's a big bite bait jig head. I mean, normal jig heads like this.
Pretty much any of your favorite jig heads will work.
Yeah, like a round ball jig head. It'll work, but they also make tube jig heads for it. So like the lead on it is tapered a little bit more.
So you mean like you slide it up into the tube?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, okay.
A little tip from me, it might be gross, but I mean, kind of spit on it, put it in your mouth so you can slide it in that tube a little bit better. So these tubes, right in the back of them, if you pull away the skirt, they're hollow on the inside. So you actually put your jig head in through the middle of it. That's why, I put a little spit on it to lube it up. But just slide it in, so then it's way easier to do it. Just a little tip from Jake.
So what kind of floats are you fishing for those?
So
that water's a little deeper.
Before we go over that, I like fishing those tubes when those fish are very, very negative. Very, very negative or in a neutral state. They don't have a whole crap ton of action like a Bobby Garland does or a hot grub. The skirt on the back, it has a little bit of a flare or anything like that. But I mean, it's not very intrusive, and they'll be more willing to come up and take a pop at it.
So when you say negative or neutral mood, what exactly do you mean?
So a negative or a neutral mood means when they're not totally fired up and aggressive. If you can see any of those fish in the water, like I learn a lot from watching fish. I mean, once you see those bluegill and they have their dorsal fin popped up, those perch, they have their dorsal fin popped up, their pec fins are flared up and everything, they're ready to eat, they're aggressive. But if they're just sitting there kind of neutral in the water, they're not really chasing after anything, their dorsal fins kind of laying on their back still, and they're not really pulsating their pec fins, they're typically in a neutral,
Non-feeding mood.
yeah, non-feeding mood. So you really have to coax them to come up and take a bite out of your bait.
Okay.
So floats, I mean, just your classic, you can get them anywhere, but they're just like your cigar float. It's an Eagle Claw cigar float. These are the unweighted ones. They do make weighted ones. It just depends on your situation. And then I don't have any with me right now because actually we're all sold out of them. But a rocket bobber, they're really dense. They're a hard plastic float. They have some weight to them, so you can really cast them out there pretty far.
I guess that would depend if you're fishing from a boat or from shore. If you're wading, you might want one of those rocket bobbers or maybe some of those weighted cigar floats to be able to get that extra casting distance. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
For sure. And then my personal favorite, this is a slip float. So if you're fishing for any fish that I would say that are deeper than 5 feet, you're going to be needing a slip float because it's kind of hard because they're fixed to your line. You can't really slide them up and down your line. So if your fish are 5 feet deep and you need to get 4 feet deep, having a 4-foot leader off of this is really hard to cast and get distance because it like flings through the air. But with a slip float,
how does that work exactly? So
with the slip float, I don't know if you'll be able to pick it up.
A little bobber stopper.
Yeah, there's a little bobber stopper. So it's a piece of thread that you actually put on your line, and that's your depth, your desired depth. And then there's a bead too. So
you put those on before you put your float on.
Correct. So it goes thread, bead, and then your float, and then your bait. So you can slide that piece of thread up and down your line, and then your bead will just follow it. That's just so your thread doesn't go through your float. That's what makes it stop. But that's your thread. That's your depth indicator. So you can slide that up to any depth.
That'll go through your guide pretty easy.
Yeah, and you can cast it through your guides too. They do make, like, I know a lot of bass guys, they use
rubber pegs.
Rubber pegs. Those are a pain in the butt to use for, for slip floats, in my opinion. Because once you reel them through your guides and you go to cast again, they kind of hit on your guides all the way out.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying, but it also decreases casting distance also.
All right, Jake, so why don't you break down what kind of rods you're going to fish for those panfish with? So,
in my opinion, I think having a proper rod is one of the most important things to being super successful in the water. With crappies, we explained it earlier, they have really light mouths.
Paper lips.
Paper lips. It's happened to all of us. It's happened to the best of us. You lose him. You see that big monster coming up. He comes straight at you with his mouth wide open, head shaking. Jig pops right out. One of the ways you can combat that is having a soft rod. So an ultralight, a light action. If you have too heavy of a rod, it can't absorb their head shakes, and you can pull hooks very, very easily. So, in my opinion, this is one of the best rods ever created for pan fishing, man.
Especially for bang for your buck. It's a pretty cheap rod overall.
Yeah, super cheap rod. It's a Okuma Celio. It's an 8-foot ultralight. So, I don't know if you can see it, but
it'll be hard to see on here.
Yeah, it has a pretty slow taper.
Please don't break that in my face.
It has a pretty slow taper, so when those fish they're sitting there and their head shaking, that rod can absorb the shock of that head shake, especially with your light line too. Typically, you're fishing with mono. That has a lot of stretch too, so that can help a lot too.
I think what he means, just to break it down a little bit, when he says slow taper, you have slow, medium, and fast. And fast, picture it like a broomstick. It has, your action is right there. As soon as you set the hook, that rod has no give to it. And slow means the load of the rod. So as you set the hook, that rod's going to have more give to it. So it's going to slowly set the hook into that. So that's just to break that down a little bit.
Like a limp noodle, a noodle rod.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, the term noodle rod comes from actually a steelhead background. they made super light rods for early season light line applications in clear water, so that rod can absorb the shock of those big fighting, those hard fighting steelhead.
Now we just use it for everything.
Yep, and now we just use it for crappies, steelhead, I mean,
trout,
even,
bluegills, everything.
Even bass in some applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Yeah, and I think one thing about the setup is the reel isn't really a huge factor in this, because a lot of times you're fishing fairly close to you, and when you set the hook, those fish, they turn sideways. If you ever notice how those fish set up, they look like a paper plate. That's why they call them slabs and whatnot. So as soon as you set the hook, they kind of turn sideways. So it's not like they come screaming in at you. They're not typically hard fighting fish unless you catch them through the ice. So just choose your favorite reel, and it'll be pretty good.
Yeah, anything from like 1,000 size reel to like a 2,500. I'm just going to go over line real quick too.
Good call.
I mean, your classic 6-pound mono, 4-pound mono. Personally, my favorite is the Sunline Supernatural in 4-pound. That stuff is incredible.
You mean it's supernatural?
It's supernatural. What I like about it, it's just very limp. And it has a really small diameter too. Once I start getting into really pressured fish, that's when I start getting into fishing fluorocarbon, 4-pound fluorocarbon, 6-pound fluorocarbon, real small diameter. I mean, anything that you would use for like your trout and your steelhead too.
We'll get into that here in a minute, won't we?
We're gonna get into it. So that fluorocarbon opposed to the mono, the fluorocarbon, it's totally invisible in the water. It's a lot more stealthy. And then the mono, I mean, if you're just fishing a clear mono, it's still a pretty stealthy technique, but it's a little bit more visible in the water. And once you're fishing around a lot of guys or in ultra gin clear water, that can be the difference between half a stringer or a full stringer.
That's fair. All right, well, that sounds like a pretty good breakdown. How about we transition now over into trout and steelhead? I'm mainly going to talk about trout because the steelhead season where we're at is kind of winding down. So like Jake, I'm going to break down the baits first, and then we'll kind of get into the gear and where you're going to be targeting them. Hopefully you're targeting them around a bridge if you're trout fishing this time of year as we get ready for this opening day. It's pretty easy to locate the access areas if you look at a map. So if you're kind of new to trout fishing, that's one thing I would do first. Everybody always talks about having these great days where they're catching a ton of fish, but early in the season, right after they've been stocked, those fish are pretty grouped up. So if you catch one, there's going to be a lot, but if you're not around them, it's pretty easy to not be around them. You're not going to catch any of them, obviously. So just go on your local map and figure out, you can even find your local stocking schedule. It usually works out pretty well, and they can tell you where they put them. And then typically go downstream from there as those fish will get washed down because you're not used to that kind of current. So that's kind of a breakdown of where you're going to want to fish. A lot of times they put in those deeper holes, whatnot, easy access points. So try that next time. So as far as baits go, you don't have to get too fancy with it just because they are stock trout. They've lived in a hatchery most of their lives until now. So your egg patterns, these are just beads, but we also carry full series egg patterns. Your beads, your eggs, in bright colors, your oranges, some of your natural colors, and your light, your peach, your pinks, and even some of the roe colors will work too. Just be sure to move them around a little bit. Never get caught fishing one pattern too long, especially when you're around a bunch of fish. So what'll happen is those fish will fire pretty quick. You'll find yourself catching 1, 2, 3, but then it'll die off. A great way to combat that is to just switch up patterns, keep those fish guessing. So I start out with an egg a lot of times, and then I'll use some of these nymphs that we talked about earlier that FishUSA just got in. We have a lot of different types of them, but these are 2 that we just got in. A hare's ear and a pheasant tail. Those are 2 really good options. Look up on our website, you can see pictures of them. It'll be hard to see at this distance. But those little natural deals really get them going because even though they have lived in a hatchery most of their lives, a lot of times they'll get pretty adept to the forage in the stream pretty quickly. So I like to fish those bugs in a size 16 to maybe even a 10 sometimes, vary that size because they're not super smart right off the bat, but as the season goes on, that's when I'll start to downsize more.
Fishing pressure is the biggest thing.
It really can be a pain once you get around a lot of people, and that's where you want to downsize and try to do something a little bit different.
I mean, fishing something different is probably the biggest thing. If everybody's, throwing a
power bait pink worm.
A power bait pink worm. That's your classic, your trout
Don't
bait.
ever throw this bait.
it's a killer. But throwing something different, even if that means throwing a different color, throwing an orange worm, a natural color, or something really bright and annoying. And then I just want to say something about an egg pattern too. I mean, your mics, your classic salmon eggs, your Potski fireballs, those are all killer baits. Those baits, just like the Bobby Garland baby shads, they've been around since the dawn of time.
They have.
We sell so many of them at FishUSA for a great reason. They just flat out catch fish.
I really like what you touched on though about just changing colors. A lot of times if you catch a fish on a certain bait, it's not that they don't like that bait anymore, but they get accustomed to it. You know, they see it so many times over and over again and see their buddies get yanked out by it. Just a simple color change can be the difference in catching a few more fish. So that's another really big thing to keep in mind. And then another thing that I really want to touch on is applying action to your bait. You know, whenever we think of trout fishing and steelhead fishing, we think of light line, making really good drifts, you know, trying to match the hatch. But sometimes it couldn't be more opposite. Sometimes you really want to just get those fish a different perspective. And that's where these voodoo jigs will come into play. You know, throwing something that imitates a little bit of a bait fish and just has some movement. And you can do this with all of these baits. You know, you can even do it with eggs, the worms, the nymphs especially. Is once you make your cast and you've dead drifted it through there. When I say dead drift, I mean just floating it with the current as natural as you can be. After I've done that a few times, if it's a really nice looking hole, I like to do what I call active nymphing, or switch to a streamer or a jig where I'm getting above those fish a little bit, or even staying in line with them and just bouncing that rod tip and letting those flies, those nymphs, have a little bit more action to them. Getting above them and fishing these jigs where you're kind of holding it in their face and just pulsating it where it's twitching in their face. And a lot of times those fish don't ever see that, and it can create some really awesome days where you have some really incredible strikes and really get those school of fish fired up. So those are always a really good option. And same thing, just switch your colors around a little bit with that.
With those streamers and big jigs like that, it's almost like they get mesmerized. If you especially if you put it on a float, and you can just hold it right there in front of their faces, you can just jig it, and jig it, and jig it. Maybe the biggest one, I've seen so many times, the biggest one will just bash through the school, just come up and choke it.
That big aggressive male, that big aggressive female.
Yep. Yeah, they get mesmerized, they don't know what it is, it just looks so dang good, they gotta put it in their mouth.
So breaking down some of the floats that you'll be using for these baits, we have a couple different selections here, and this is probably one of the most widely known, is just a little cork float that you can pop the little tab out and put back in. They're really, really inexpensive. These are like $2 for all of these, if that, maybe $1.50. But those can be used all over the place in any kind of water, but I specifically like to use those if I'm fishing shallower or if I'm fishing really light flies, because you have to think how much weight those can support. So try to keep that in mind when you're picking your float. If we get into a little bit heavier water, you're fishing some of these bigger rivers, it might be wise to go with a fixed float in a bigger size. These are some of our favorite steelhead floats, but that doesn't mean they can't be used for stock trout. These are raven floats, and what you do is you have little tubes that you would cut for each end, and you just take your line, thread it through those tubes, and then pinch it on each end, and then you can slide your float up and down to adjust the depth. And so they come in different grams. I don't know if you can see that from here. This is an 8 gram, and this is, what is this, a 4.8 gram. So that's just about the weight you're using. So you have to think about how much split shot you have on there. But just keep that in mind. Obviously, if you put a float on that's going under, you need a bigger one. So it's pretty easy to gauge that.
So like with an 8 gram float, that's a pretty big float. If you're fishing around here, like the Allegheny, big water, big float, you're going to need that heavy weight underneath your float to cut down through that current. But we do carry, Raven makes, little baby acorn floats. They're like 1 gram. So you can put just a couple pieces of split shot, or not even any split shot, just have it like a heavy jig, and that'll make that float ride correctly. But like an 8 gram float, that's for big water. But these Raven floats, they come in a variety of sizes, just according to your water conditions.
So you just match accordingly. If you're fishing low, clear water, I would go with something more similar to this. You can find your favorite brand. This is just an example of what it is. But one thing I really want to touch on is the depth, because I feel like that's where a lot of people mess up. And a good rule of thumb is you want your float to be 1.5 times the depth of the water above your flies, and that's to your bottom fly if you're fishing a tandem rig. And that's just something that I see time and time again where people misjudge that. You see it every day, steelhead fishing and trout fishing, where guys have a 9-foot 5X leader and they have their float 6 feet up it. But what you have to think about is how much line there is between you and that fish and that float. So what happens is, as that current's coming down, if it's not one steady current stream, it'll grab your line and move it in certain ways to where if that fish eats it, you won't have any idea that it's there with that float by the time it spits it out. So you want to be in as close to contact as you can with that, while just having as much line out as you need. And that can be kind of confusing, but that's just how that works. So let's talk about some of the hooks that I like to throw with some of these baits. And these are going to be specifically for if you're fishing like salmon eggs or some of these Berkeley power bait worms or even night crawlers. I like to have an open, kind of like a circle hook, but not exactly. It's a straight shank hook, and what it allows is, if you think about the bend of your hook, and you have to think about that gap that's there. So between your eye and the point of your hook, if you have a really tight gap, that means you're not going to have a lot to hold onto when you set the hook, and not a lot to grab onto. But the wider that is, the more meat that those hooks are going to hold. So that's why I like a wide gap. And I have 2 different sizes here. I have a 12 and an 8. And this just goes again with the size bait you're going to be fishing. You want to cover that hook up as much as you can so those fish don't see it, because a lot of times we're fishing clear water applications. If you're throwing a really big night crawler, I wouldn't worry about it. I would throw an 8. I might even throw a 6, because you're going to be, if they're looking at a giant night crawler like that, they're not going to be as concerned with the hook. But if you're putting a small salmon egg on, I might go with a 14, a 16. I would downsize that for sure. So again, just matching your bait with what you're throwing, or matching your hook with what bait you're throwing. So next thing we're going to talk about, did you have anything else you wanted to add to the baits, or did you think that was pretty good? Why don't you break down some of those spinners and spoons we got there for us?
So this is just your classic CP swing. Again, been around since the dawn of time.
How many of those I've found in the creeks?
Yeah, I mean,
A ton.
I think our grandfathers' fished this bait.
They did.
Yeah, definitely. But just your classic brass. It's a spinner. That blade, it just pulsates in the water, gives off a real nice vibration, and it really just makes those fish want to eat. It's loud and annoying.
So it triggers them.
It triggers them. It's an aggression strike. It's a reaction strike. You burn that thing past their face, and they just gotta come up and smoke it. And then
This little guy.
yeah, and then that's
out of the
open.
package.
But just a Castmaster, really bright color. You can fish really bright colors, or you can fish natural. Chartreuse and silver, orange and silver, and blue and silver. Blue and silver is probably my favorite color, whether it's for steelhead or stock trout. It's just a very natural color, and it's just produced over the years.
What I like to do with these baits, if you're a bait fisherman, is it's a really good tool to cover water with. If you're fishing bigger stretches of water, ponds, lakes, etc., what you can do with these is find a pod of active fish, because like I said, they're going to be grouped up. So this isn't necessarily a catch 100 fish bait, but it's catch a couple to let you know where they're at, and that's where you can go back in with some of the other presentations that we talked about and really start to wear on them with it.
For sure.
But let's break down some of the rods and reels that we're going to be using. Pretty much the same setup that Jake had here for crappie fishing and pan fishing, I also love. So that Okuma rod, an 8-foot, if you're fishing, any smaller streams. But once you get into some bigger creeks, I like to upsize that to a 10-foot rod, just to be able to cast a little bit more and a little bit further, and be able to pick up line better. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. If you're fishing smaller streams, don't be afraid to downsize it to a 6-foot or a 7-foot model. But you want that same soft action, because those fish, a lot of times you're fishing light line, just similar as you would be for panfish. So you want that longer, noodlier rod to be able to give you some leverage on those fish and to kind of take away the straight pull on that line, so you don't break that line off. So that's a good spinning setup for you. Your reels, I like a 2500 series. You can go down to a 1000 series too, but a 2500 will pick line up a lot faster. And if you don't know reel sizes, what I'm talking about is the gear ratio and the spool size on those reels. So the bigger you go in the gear ratio and the spool size, like 1000, 2500, 3000, 1500, that's just going to be upsizing how much line it picks up at once. So keep that in mind when you're buying your reels. Let's talk about our fly fishing setups a little bit. I'll move that around a little bit. I don't know if you can see it. This is an Orbis Clearwater. If I'm trout fishing, and specifically for stock trout, I like anywhere from a 2 to a 5 weight, anywhere in that area. But if you're a beginner to it, I would go with a 4 weight. A 4 weight is a great all-around action rod. I use it for steelhead a lot of times. And you match the reel to your rod. So if you buy a 4 weight rod, I would buy a 4 weight reel. It's just going to be able to balance that rod really, really well. And then a big thing with your line is you want to get it paired with a good floating line. This is a nice Rio line. You can always go down in line size, but I would never go up. So when you're buying your floating line, if I have a 4 weight, I might put a 3 weight on it because that means that line's going to be a little bit thinner and easier to cast. Whereas if you put a size heavier on there, it's going to overpower the rod. It's better to underpower your rod than overpower it. So keep that in mind when you're buying your tapered lead or your floating line setups.
So on the line, so on your fly line, and it says a taper on it. What exactly does that mean, John?
Oh, so what it has is, if you look on the back of these, you can see anywhere. What it has is it's called a shooting head. So if you look at those lines, the back of the line, like what you would put on your reel first, is going to be a lot thinner because that line really isn't doing a whole lot. But at the beginning of your line, that's where it's going to have that shooting head like I talked about, which is going to be that floating material, which is going to be the heavier line, which will allow you to cast distance with it. Because that's what fly fishing is all about. That's why it was created, was being able to use the line to carry the flies. With spin fishing, you're using the weight of the bait, and fly fishing, you're using the weight of the line. So that's why we use that heavier line, is to be able to cast small flies long distances. And it was primarily for dry fly fishermen, but it works just as well for nymphing and whatnot.
So the front of that line, the front of the taper, the head, the shooting head, it's heavier, so you're able to roll cast a lot easier. So it goes your head, which is a lot thicker, so that's going to be closer to your leader. That's the front part of your line, and then it just slowly tapers down. Like I said, the thicker it is, you're easier to roll cast. So.
Okay. And then let's talk about leaders, because this is where a lot of people struggle. What I like to do is I like to get a standard 9-foot 4X leader if you're buying standard leaders like this and you're new to it. And then what I like to do is this is Blood Run 4-pound. Pretty much any of your favorite line will work, but I like fluorocarbon for this aspect because it's going to have a thinner diameter. So I would like to go 4-pound, 5-pound, even down to 2-pound. But I would get another spool of this. So you connect this leader to the end of your fly line, to your shooting head, and then off of this I would tie a connector knot, like a blood knot or a surgeon's knot. We can do a video on that later, but for now we're just going to talk about it. And then I would add some of this tippet material is what it's called. So this is your standard leader, and this would be your tippet material. Your tippet material is what you're going to tie your flies to.
So instead of using a blood knot or a surgeon's knot or something, super easy, a tippet ring.
Tippet ring, that is also a great option.
A tippet ring or just a very, very small barrel swivel too. So like Raven, they make, I think they're like 3x small barrel swivels.
Think about that. That's a good idea.
Super, super easy just to tie from your tapered leader down to your barrel swivel, and then you can tie your 4-pound fluorocarbon off the bottom of that. Makes it a lot easier. Plus you can, if you want to change line really quick, or your tippet. So if you want to bump up the 6-pound, if you're around bigger fish or around here, a lot of our fish, or our stock trout, get stocked in steelhead streams. So a lot of times when you're fishing for stock trout, you'll always hook into that big old steelhead, and fishing 4-pound, sometimes they'll break you off, especially like those very chrome fish. They come out of the lake, they're crazy. I've had them break 8-pound like it's nothing.
So match your line to your application.
Yeah.
Is what he's saying.
Match your line to your application. But a Cortland, they make real small tippet rings, or Raven, they make real small barrel swivels also.
Both of those are really good options. I prefer the line to line, but that's just me personally. Tippet ring is also a great option. But yeah, just match your line to whatever you're fishing for. So keep a spool of tippet on you at all times, and that size you're going to need. Great standard size is 4X and 6X. Those are pretty good all around. They work well for streamer fishing or for nymphing. So I think that's about all we had to cover today, unless you have anything else you wanted to talk about.
I think we're good. So in the comments, drop any questions,
Right.
comments.
We love questions.
Yeah, we love questions. I mean, if we didn't cover everything, I think we covered everything. But we always
Got
miss
the basics anyway.
Yeah, we got the basics. We always miss things. Drop questions in the comments, and personally, we'll go back and we'll answer them for you.
Absolutely. So if you don't already, be sure I will add our Instagram tags down below. Be sure to follow us. This is Jake Snyder. I'm Jon Dietz. Because we're always going on crazy adventures, and we'll keep you guys updated on what's going on with FishUSA and some of the new products and stuff we got in. So I think that's all the time we had today, but thanks so much for watching, and we hope to see you on the water.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you later.